don't stop.
And this issue of how much attention and how much coverage to give terrorists and how much time to spend discussing terrorism is something that I think a lot of us have thought about. As being a journalist myself who has covered many terrorist attacks, it is something I have often grappled with. Are we part of the solution? Are we part of the problem? How much is too much? Certainly, it's something we can't ignore, but are we spending too much time on it? Or, as President Donald Trump has suggested, are we not covering it enough?
My point of view, for what it's worth, is that I don't think terrorism is very important. And I think we make it important, and by making it important, we make it important. It does not matter very much. A terrorist incident is a happening. It's an accident. It affects the people directly affected by it. But terrorism does not threaten states. It doesn't threaten the integrity of America or Britain. They can't invade us. They can't do serious damage to our economy unless we let them. They cannot affect our values, our democracy, anything like that, unless we let them. They are, to all intents and purposes, useless criminals. They simply blow things up and kill people. The only point at which they threaten us is by our reaction to them. They have no standing whatsoever, other than in terms of our reaction to them. And our reaction to them is conditioned by the publicity we give them. They depend upon publicity. The multiplier of publicity is what makes the terrorism act terrorist. Otherwise, it's just a killing. That's why very few terrorist incidents occur in autocratic and dictatorial countries. They don't get any publicity.
I mean, the institution of terrorism, as you've said, it's all about fear. It's about really creating fears, instilling fear, terrorizing the enemy, and also about inspiring and motivating the base. They want to motivate the base, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan, or even some of the deluded young men in Western societies. And they also as a potential recruitment technique. So when CNN and BBC and all of us go and talk about the attacks in Paris or Brussels, or this is basically feeds into their narrative. They matter greatly. They have the capacity to terrorize Western societies. In fact, our coverage and obsession with terrorism, we are providing oxygen to populist movement in Western societies. We are distorting domestic politics in the West. In fact, this obsession with these kind of limited threat is providing oxygen to hyper, far-right movements. And in many ways, it's really changing, dramatically transforming Western politics, not just playing into the narrative of ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Terrorism can do serious damage. And as everybody knows, just from that one thing that's already come up twice this evening, the attacks in Paris in November 2015, it still is doing damage. Still, the Parisian economy, the tourist economy is not recovered from that. It's still a city suffering from that. Now, I don't know how you could get into a situation where multiple suicide bombings go off in the nearest capital city to this one, where multiple suicide bombings go off at a football match, at a rock venue, drive-by shootings, Kalashnikov attacks in cafes and restaurants, and that wasn't reported, or it just was mentioned, and we all got on with our lives. The public want to know that information. We want to know, I'm going to go to Paris next weekend. Is it a wise idea? Is it good to go or not? Of course we need this information, and we need the media to be reporting it. And I have to say that we have to appreciate what the end point of Simon's point of view on this is. In 2013, when two British converts to Islam, two very radical young men, ran over in broad daylight in South London, in this city, ran over a soldier at home on leave from Afghanistan, Drummer Lee Rigby, hacked at his body in the middle of the road, tried to get his head off with machetes, and so on. Simon described that as a mundane act of violence. Now, I don't think that is a mundane act. It was in your Guardian column at the time.
Oh, sorry.
Anyhow.
It was a mundane act of violence.
But, you see, for most of us, the general public, we don't think that the reporting of a soldier being decapitated in broad daylight by two such men is a mundane thing. It is certainly an act of violence, but we have to be very careful. That is the end point of dismissing the terrorists, of saying we don't give them any oxygen. We try to get around it in some way. Now, I think, by the way, that the censorship around terrorism already exists to an enormous extent in our societies. The media in this country and in America and elsewhere don't show anything like explicit images of the aftermaths of terrorist attacks. And there is a very good argument that actually if the public saw what those of us who've covered and seen attacks have seen, that their views on this would be a lot harder than they currently are, and that the media actually holds this back from the public, and that as a result the public are less enraged than they would otherwise be by this. For the BBC, the BBC chose to not use that term. It's so-called Islamic State, as the BBC. Well, that's an editorial decision it takes about the group. I've often said, I keep on hearing the BBC called the so-called Islamic State more times, I'll put my so-called shoes through the so-called television. But it's an infuriating editorial decision, which they've taken before you've even got to reporting the story. That's why you can speak to a lot of people in this country who, despite this, what we're talking about here as being an over-coverage, still have very little idea of what it is that ISIS wants. Because we actually don't have a lot of that discussion, because our broadcasters and our press don't want to have a lot of that discussion. And so we go round and round on the pornography of violence. I'd much rather we had those bigger and deeper discussions that meant that people knew what was actually going on with this group, what they actually want, and what groups like them want. But just very quickly, I've got to pick up as well on this mention about Sweden, if I may, because this actually does get to a core divide that's going on at the moment. I do not enjoy the bifurcation of American media, I have to say. I don't like the fact that increasingly these are two sides talking about each other, but never to each other. And I think it's enormously regrettable for democracy as a whole. That said, there is a specific problem which the Sweden story actually talks to. Now, as it happens, I've just finished the book, which Fawaz will be, by agreement, promoting any moment. No, which comes out in May. But it's about the migration crisis in Europe. And I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. So the media doesn't cover the story. Okay, you could say, well, who cares about Sweden, or it's just, you know, it's just this. But the fact is that the non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha, 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 it's so hilarious. Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide.
May I just, I mean, I'm glad you have mentioned Donald Trump, and what really worries me a great deal is not about whether we discuss, I mean, the phenomenon of terrorism. We should. I think the phenomenon of terrorism is going to be with us for the next 20, 30 years. It's byproduct of globalization. It's part of breakdown of societies in the Muslim world, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria. Really what we are seeing in the West here, basically the reverberations of the breakdown of the state system in many countries. I mean, this is just, that's why I said it's nuisance. What alarms me a great deal is when I hear Donald Trump and other politicians in the heart of Europe collapsing terrorism with the refugees, collapsing terrorism with migration, collapsing terrorism with Islam. And then you have a big existential problem in our hands. This is really where Western politics now, this is the question, this is the challenge. How do you separate, how do you de-link the phenomenon of terrorism, which is dangerous, in a limited way, right? Limited way. I mean, I call them really organized networks criminality. Why do we treat terrorism different than the mafia? Why do we invest terrorism with existential cultural overtones? I mean, the overwhelming majority of Muslims, I mean, this cliche, have nothing to do with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. The overwhelming majority of victims are Muslims, whether in Iraq or Syria or Libya or Egypt or Afghanistan. But this is what we really are going round and round the question. To what extent does Donald Trump now use, and he has used the question of ISIS very effectively, politicians in the heart of Europe.
Douglas itching to just
very
get in
quick,
there.
it's slightly off the topic, but just it reiterates the point I was just trying to make, which is that an absence on one side creates something on the other. And this is a very good example. I've said it for a long time. If your entire media says that Islamic extremism has nothing to do with Islam, you will create a movement that says it's all to do with Islam, and all Muslims must be involved. In the same way as if you pretend that no migrant into Europe is ever going to be anything other than the most brilliant PhD student, you will create a movement that says they're all terrorists. I mean, that is part of the problem.
Simon?
But how do you answer the problem? I'll come back to Clarissa's question. I mean, you've got a peculiar thing here. You've got a requirement which all intelligent liberal people say, which is to cover responsibly world events. There are lots of terrorist incidents in the Congo, in Uganda, or Nigeria, or Sudan. We just don't cover them. It's darkest Africa. We don't cover them. It doesn't matter how horrific they are. We don't cover them because we've got this thing. We cover terrorists. And terrorists is something that happens to us in our country, not in their country. Now, if we give terrorism what I still think is a ludicrously exaggerated extent of coverage, and I wouldn't go as far as you or Douglas in saying, you know, I want to show pictures of the dead bodies as well, in order to enrage the population even further.
We should, but yeah.
I mean, I just want to suppress that, because unless you suppress these sort of tabloid images, it's very difficult to get a conversation going about what is happening in Nigeria or Sudan or somewhere else. And I do come to a point which I never ever thought I would in my life, of saying that I just somehow think the concept of censorship, self-censorship, but censorship, has got to be part of this debate.
We are talking about terror through a lens of terrorism that happens to white Westerners. And Douglas, you asked the question earlier, like, how would we stop it? And I think the simple answer to how we stop it is that we do appear to stop it whenever it happens to Muslim people, brown people, black people. Look at what happened in Canada. And I know it's very easy for us all to say, nobody changed their Facebook profile to a Canadian flag and says, Je suis Canada. But we need to have that discussion. Why are we as the media complicit in not covering terrorism that happens to people of other faiths?
Okay. So.
As you know, before the Paris attacks, there was a major attack in Beirut, in western Beirut, in which 200 people were killed. It received hardly any attention.
I was there.
But hardly any attention in Beirut. I was in Beirut too, and there was a great deal of controversy. Why BBC and CNN does not really respond to an attack that killed hundreds of people were in Paris? Again, it tells you a great deal. But
I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much about the coverage of terrorist attacks that have a proximity to where we are. This always happens after a terrorist attack now. People say, you know, why, as far as says, you know, why have you got so much attention on Paris and less on Beirut? It's because Paris is Paris and Beirut is Beirut, and Paris is near us, and most people feel more kinship, and they've probably been to Paris, and more people have been there than they've been to Beirut. I mean, you can always play this game. It's regrettable, but it's not only us, you know, in our country that feels like that. When something happens near you, it's of more import to you than if it happens far away, and sadly, the Middle East feels far away for most people. And so, of course, that's going to be the case. We might regret it, but it's not unnatural that that's the way in which the things are covered. Over 3 presidents now since 9/11, they've all taken a different tack, and the response has pretty much been the same. Nobody likes to remember this, but what was the first thing that George W. Bush did as president after 9/11? He went to the Islamic Center in Washington, read his favorite bits of the Quran, and insisted Islam is a peaceful religion. This has nothing to do with Islam. Okay, no, and everyone, of course, subsequently, you know, nobody gave him credit for it, but that was George W. Bush. Barack Obama refuses to say that Islamic extremism when a man shouting Allahu Akbar at Fort Hood kills a dozen Marines. It was described famously as workplace violence. And so this thing comes up. What are they holding from us? Why are they lying to us? We can see what it is. Why are you not saying that the guy shouting Allah is greatest whilst gunning people down may be doing it for theological reasons? And you start to do the contrary thing. And that's why you now get, as I say, this situation. It's the same thing, as I say, with the migration, with European politics and all this stuff. The public aren't onto nothing when they're worried that the media is holding some of this stuff back from them. I mean, Barack Obama was berated at the UN by David Cameron for this. It was Cameron who said at the UN a year or so ago, you know, it's not enough that you say it has nothing to do with religion. You've got to admit it has to do something with religion in order to deal with it. But we are creating contrary forces all the time at the moment.